Yeah, hello everybody. Welcome back. We have talked a lot about market interventions, especially tariffs, the last time. After this lecture, hopefully I can upload also the exercise which we have done, and I would recommend that you go carefully through the calculations by your own later on. Yeah, okay. Well, so to speak, we finished now the so-called neoclassical trade theory, starting with Ricardo in the 19th century, or also already you can find these model of comparative advantage, although of course also in the work of Adam Smith, because it's not only a reason for trade, it's just a reason for labor division, that everybody is doing what he can. Very, very important, relatively the best way. Not only in the absolute way, but relatively. And this relatively means also that, so to speak, industrial countries trade with developing countries, and that they both win later on, or they can win, especially later on. Yeah, and now we are, so to speak, in the 1960s, 1970s, and especially after World War II, when, so to speak, for the Western country of the earth started the interaction between trading between the United States or America and Europe and so on. And what we then found is that we are not only specializing our production with respect to comparative advantage, and in the end also this concept of comparative advantage is also the main reason within the specific factors model, and also the main reason afterwards in the so-called general equilibrium model of Heckscher-Ohlin. But then also we are trading different goods. Everybody is more or less specializing in Ricardo for 100%, and in the other models not for 100%, but the main reason is to trade different goods. And then what we found, especially in the developing of international trade after World War II, is that we also trade the same goods. And if we look at the volumes, we even trade more the same goods than we are trading different goods. So roughly you can say 2/3 of international trade volume represents trading more or less the same goods. And yeah, the most prominent examples are of course cars. Cars are more or less produced in every developed country. You find some car factories, and then we are driving Japanese cars, we are driving French cars, and so on. I'm not now talking about then in the end the development of electromobility, but we are around the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. And also, if you look at pharmaceutical products, if you look at chemical products, then it is always more or less that we are trading the same goods. And this we cannot explain with the so-called neoclassical trade theory. And one main reason, one main assumption which we make in the neoclassical theory, and I also mentioned this, is that we are producing under constant returns to scale. And remember, constant returns to scale production function means that in optimum we have zero profits. And zero profits are also quite compatible with fully competitive markets. And now we relax these assumptions and say, well, there are some industries, and especially the industries which I already mentioned, the car industry, pharmaceutical, chemical industry, there especially you find very large companies. And then maybe you think of your business administration course. This when you maybe have talked about mergers and acquisitions, where two medium or already two large companies, international companies, just join together to form an even larger company. And what is the main reason? Well, to create market power and via this mergers and acquisitions, where via this merging two already large companies is of course also to reduce average costs. That you, so to speak, say you have two human resource departments within your companies, and afterwards, of course, you have a larger human resource department in your company, but you think or you hope that afterwards this department is not, if you have two more or less two same size companies, that this department is not twice as large as before, but only 1.7 times as large as before. So that overall you could have reduced average costs in your company. Well, and this then, think of this human resource department, then means if you double your input, you obtain more than double output, or if you double your output, this would not mean, as in constant returns to scale, doubling costs, still zero profits, but less than double costs. And yeah, this about this, we now want to start to talk in a general way. Again, look at it. Constant returns to scale means doubling input, means doubling output. Increasing returns to scale means doubling output, maybe doubling input 3 times the output. Or, of course, what could also happen, would be not very nice, but in order to be complete, decreasing returns to scale would mean doubling output, doubling input, sorry, and you have less than double output. 2 times input and you still have the same output. But this, of course, would be a very bad situation and you would not be a very long time within the market if you have such a production function. Okay, and now we translate this in costs. So, and here, in order to take an easy example, we take, so to speak, the production function, not the neoclassical production function with more than one input, but we take just the production function you know from Ricardo, only one input factor, labor, and then, of course, this means if you have constant returns to scale, you have to have a linear dependence between input and output, because we take only labor as an input, only one input factor, then constant returns to scale, linear production function, compare Ricardo. Okay, well then, if we assume that we are a price taker, so we have to take the wage rate within the labor market, then of course this means linear costs. The slope is then just the wage rate. And then marginal costs. Remember these marginal costs? We, of course, need to calculate the optimum, the profit maximizing production amount, because I'm producing up to this point where the next additional output unit from the next additional output unit, I obtain a revenue which just matches the next additional cost I create by this next additional output. Well, of course, and the first derivative of a linear function is just a constant, and therefore it's a horizontal line. So marginal costs equals here C prime of y. Well, and then decreasing returns to scale. Then, and please do not mix this now with the neoclassical production function, because in the neoclassical production function, don't mix this with the neoclassical production function, because there, this right banded we obtained from production is depending on two production factors. And there we assumed that we have positive but decreasing marginal marginal products of the production of the input factors. But if we take only one input factor, then this of course also means that the additional output is decreasing with respect to an increase of the input. The other way around, and maybe you remember this from your micro course, means that of course you have convex costs, because you are still a price taker. So every additional worker costs you the same wage rate, but the 11th additional worker produces less additional output than the second additional worker. But you have to pay the same price, the same wage rate. Therefore, the next, maybe the 57th unit of output is therefore more costly than the 10th unit of output, because the workers, the number of your workers you need for the 57th unit of output is larger than the number of workers you need for the 10th unit of output. I think this, or hopefully this, you have heard in other lectures. So everything is coming again. Well, and then, of course, a convex function means that we have an increasing marginal cost function. Well, if this, for example, would be c of x is x squared, then of course c prime of x or y, sorry, I have taken y here, would be 2y, and then you would have a linear line, but it of course could also be just any increasing function, or in general any increasing function. Well, and then we come to the increasing returns to scale. This, of course, then means that we start with a convex production function. Remember this point of mergers and acquisitions. Let's also think of you have research department of research and development in both medium-sized companies. There your very clever people are sitting, and then you put these clever people together, and then of course you hope that overall, this new department is not twice as clever as before, but that they produce very new innovations, yeah, with a much higher probability than before. And therefore, this is then, so to speak, a qualitative explanation for a convex production function. Of course, this then means that the 10th additional worker creates more additional units of output than the second additional worker. Still, you pay the same price for these workers, and so this translates in opposite to decreasing returns to scale into a right-banded, a concave cost functions. And then, of course, concave means that the slope still positive, but that the slope of these cost function is decreasing, and therefore you have to have also a decreasing marginal cost function. So again, for example, sorry, this should be C, oops, this one, C. For example, C of y equals square root of y, and then we obtain C prime of y is 1/2 over 1 over square root of y. Okay, this of course should be also some kind of revision for you. This hopefully you have heard in your introductory courses, and actually I know that you have heard this in micro, in mathematics and so on, because I'm talking with my fellow colleagues. Okay, so if we then summarize this, and then we make these new assumption that we have some parts in our economy where we have increasing returns to scale, that we can translate this in the cost function and in marginal costs, means still we assume constant factor prices, and then of course we can argue that marginal or average costs will fall if production is increasing. And this main assumption, this is then called within the main assumption of the so-called new trade theory. And yeah, maybe the most famous representative of the new trade theory is Paul Krugman, Nobel laureate in, I think it was it 2006? I think so. Well, you can look it up, or I look it up. Sorry. Paul Krugman, Nobel laureate, 2008. Okay. Let's take also a picture from Wikipedia, then I think I'm allowed to take it. So, professor, I think at Columbia, I don't know. And yeah, in his younger years, he has written 3, 4 very famous little papers about the so-called new trade theory. And yeah, more or less, he has done much more, but more or less the core of his work for which he has obtained the Nobel Prize was this development of the new trade theory. Okay, so, well, now we want to try to start to explain with this new assumption the trade between countries. And there, of course, we also have to make other assumptions. Now we assume, and there you can think of the automotive sector, that consumers have in general in developed countries more or less the same preferences in general. Remember when we talked about tariffs and the dependencies and yeah, the conditions under which tariffs work between in the United States and the EU, then we argued that the population has more or less the same preferences, but that we also assume that we have a preference that there is not only one car, but that we have a preference for a differentiation of product so that we can choose between more or less the more or less between products with the same properties. Think of a medium-sized Toyota and a medium-sized VW. They have more or less the same properties, but they are still in some parts different, but only slightly. And that we, yeah, like to choose between, let's say, 10 in general, same products with slight differentiations. And then we think that then still we have a specialization, but in general, everybody is producing cars in general, but everybody is now producing his variant. And I always think about my parents. They, of course, or not of course, or maybe of course, because this is sometimes said that a teacher drives always a Passat variant if you have two kids or something like this. Maybe you have found this also when you went to school. And there it was more or less clear that over their whole lifetime, they will always buy a VW. Although a Ford or Opel in the same size is the same car, but maybe 2,000 German marks or afterwards euros cheaper in price. But still, there we drove always VW. And this, due to increasing economies of scale, we think that we have this falling average costs. And this then means if we have specialized, that we have, but only with the product variants, the number of the product variants will then not decrease. We have only a specialization with everybody within every country, but still every country forms the world market, and then we have still the same the same number of product variants, but due to increasing economies of scales, we can fill this market now with, where have I written it down here, lower average costs. And this is, of course, then a general benefit. Of course, then we also find within these product variants that some are importers and some are exporters, or we import then the Toyota. Well, and this I directly see here when I'm talking about this. So somehow, again, Mr. Trumbull tries, I think, to change this. So what we find here is, and this I directly see in this lecture, because this decreasing average costs is a reason. Well, the reason for this is that we are producing in Germany, in Mexico, in the United States, parallelly. And what he wants to do, this I have to put in my research paper, I think, because what he wants to do is that BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and the producers or the US American producers which are producing right now in Mexico, that they all move into the United States, directly producing there. But then, of course, you have less competitive markets. The countries are not competing anymore with each other. And then, of course, you cannot argue still with this general decreasing average cost function. Again. Yeah. And then, of course, the consequence is now not that we are producing different goods, but that we are only producing different variants of goods, which are in general the same one. Okay, so this is then, so to speak, qualitatively going through this argumentation. And of course, you know this in my lectures, that we also will start then with a formal explanation. But at first, I want to introduce two different argumentations. Until this, I mainly argued within the automotive sector and then with large companies. And this argumentation we call then internal economies of scale. And these internal economies of scale come from the size of the company. So in order to obtain this property of the production function, we need large companies. Mergers and acquisitions, remember this. And the reason for this is, of course, and there, think then not about the automotive sector, but about the pharmaceutical sector. Producing the goods in the pharmaceutical sector to produce, what is it? Is it medicaments? No. What is it called in English? This I have to look up. Sorry. I'm sorry for this. Oops. I have to implement it in PowerPoint. Have you already used this? Because with implementing DeepL in PowerPoint, you can directly translate your slides. You do not have to take out your sentences and then put it in, but you just upload, so to speak, or if it's already implemented, then you just click on please translate the slide and he directly translates your slide, and this is marvelous. This is absolutely marvelous. I think you can just take it because you got a license of Office 365 as a student here. Just try this. So medications, medicine. Okay. I was right. Medicaments. Okay. So, in order to introduce a medicament in the market, you have really very, very high research costs and development costs. Roughly, one says it's about $1 billion US. So very high fixed costs, of course, then You cannot do it within your company situated just in a garage. And this means then a certain size for efficient production, and then still pharmaceutical sector, automotive sector, companies produce differentiate products for which the prices can slightly vary. Remember my argument from my mother and father that they have paid more or less for the same car 2,000, 3,000 German marks in the 1990s more because they have bought a VW and not a Opel or Ford or something like this. Okay, but then we can also argue that we find this possibility of increasing economies of scale when we look at very small companies. And this we call then external economies of scale. And there, the argumentation comes from the argument that we have, so to speak, many companies competing with each other. So the number of companies is very high. So to speak, we have a large sector. So it depends on the size of the sector. So compare these with here the size of company. So size of company versus size of sector, internal and external. And here again, we think that these companies more or less offer or producing the same products. And where do we find these situation? Well, we find this in when we see somehow a clustering that more or less geographically at one region we find 100 companies producing or selling the same product. Well, and one thing or one condition where we find is I have studied in Heidelberg, and of course every US American, every Japanese, and during the last 10, 15 years also every Chinese tourist traveling through Germany, his plane is landing in Frankfurt and then he comes this, I think, 80 kilometers down to Heidelberg. They all pass through the old city. And there, of course, we find, I don't know, 20 souvenir shops selling the same products. Or when maybe you have visited the so-called Oberrheintal, River Rhine, is also very famous. And there in Rüdesheim, this is called the Drosselgasse. And there you find more or less 50 souvenir shops within a street of a length of, I don't know, 200 meters, 50 shops, and every shop is selling the same thing. And of course, going to the famous Silicon Valley, there you find 1,000 startups. And from these 1,000 startups, 100 of these startups working on more or less the same innovation. And there, then we can argue, well, if we have these large companies, then they have some kind of monopoly power, but not a pure monopoly. We call this, they can slightly, seeing the average price in the sector, they can slightly differ from the price. And this we call then monopolistic competition. We come to this at the, when we look at the first formal argumentation, we look at the concept of monopolistic competition. Or have you talked about monopolistic competition in other lectures already? Have you heard this? Yeah? Okay, good. So, but if we have then here our 50 souvenir shops in the Drosselgasse, then of course there we have a highly, highly competitive market with more or less perfect competition. Okay, but now we come to the formal explanation, and especially we look here at monopolistic competition. I think we can make this today. Okay, so we make this quite simple assumption. I think this you have done 100 times, especially in introductory courses in business administration, that we assume linear cost function, and with, sorry, this also has to be English, then C and CF small c. Sorry. Where is it? Where is my? No. Here we are. Have I written in the wrong slides? This is bad. Sorry for this. Then maybe I have written within this one. Yep. Okay, then I use this and I interchange this later on. So this then, hopefully I have changed here no, I haven't. So then I do not change this because this and the other way would otherwise puzzle you. So these are costs, fixed costs, and this small k is then your marginal cost. Here we have it. Okay, and then dk is average cost. Average cost is just cost divided by output x. So fixed cost divided by x, and therefore here you have a hyperbola. This means the larger the output, the less is the average cost part of the fixed cost, and this you have called fixed cost regression. Fixed cost regression. Well, and if we look then at these hyperbola falling 1 over x more or less, and this means we always will be slightly above the marginal cost small k, but in the limit we will be just at these small k. So it looks just like this. And well, this is our falling average cost function. This comes from the argumentation of increasing returns to scale, comes from the argumentation of increasing returns to scale. So, and this falling average cost function we will use in a minute. Okay, so we want to talk in general about monopolistic competition and then our assumptions. We have few companies, not too much. Think of large car manufacturers in the world. There, I don't know, you have roughly 10, 20 or something like this. And this means we find their quasi monopolies. And they producing product variants. And they can set individual prices which have to be oriented at the average price of the industry. And we assume then here that these prices, well, maybe it's too strong to say totally independent, but everybody orients itself on the average price. But if I'm not directly oriented at the price of the other company, this is meant by independent. And though to speak, this is, somehow, if you look at oligopoly theory, and I think this you also have already heard in other lectures, when you are looking only at two companies. And then you have calculated their optimal behavior, and there you have assumed, well, I'm maximizing my profits, assuming the output of the other one is given. Have you done this? Two companies, and I'm setting the output of the. We are selling in the same market, so the whole X for the whole market is X1 plus X2, and so to speak, this is a feed in the overall demand curve. If the demand is 10 minus capital X, and capital X is X1 plus X2, and then, so to speak, you feed in the demand function like a monopolist, but one part of this demand function is the fixed assumption of X2 of the other company. And this was this Cournot competition, because this model was invented or firstly described by Cournot in the midst of the 19th century. Well, and the famous thing is that for this example, his argumentation is the same argumentation which then in general made John Nash by defining a Nash equilibrium in game theory. I think about the prisoner's dilemma you have already talked in game theory and maybe some other things. And Cournot, because then of course we also call this in economics Cournot-Nash equilibrium. Okay, so to speak, we take the prices of the other companies as given. In Cournot competition, you take the X2, so the amount of output of the other company as given. Therefore, I said compare this with Cournot competition. Also, we think that, or we assume that every company has the same cost structure. So that the cost structure at Toyota does not differ very much from the cost structure in Wolfsburg. And this, if we see then into the production sites, then this is also a quite good assumption. Also in the pharmaceutical sector, they all produce, so to speak, with the same machines and so on. And also this, the skill of the workers is more or less the same within these large companies. And then in the end, they produce differentiated products, not very different products. Here again, still we are, so to speak, in the automotive sector. So, and now comes the formal part that in general we define a demand function, and here I have to explain the letters within these demand function. There we say, well, the overall demand, of course, depends on capital S, the size of the sector. The larger the demand, the larger the size, the higher the demand. This is, yeah, a quite general and usual assumption. And then we say, and look at this here, here is a minus sign. So this is the individual price of the company. Do I have it here? Price of the single firm. So if you multiply out this bracket here and you do not think about the other numbers or given the other numbers as fixed, then we have a constant minus B times P. Well, and this is what you have always done within your lectures. You always thought more or less. You think within linear demand function, and it's just falling, starting at a constant, and then with slope B, it is falling in price. So, but then we say it's also decreasing in the number of firms. Oh, sorry. Yeah. In the number of firms, because then, yeah, more or less, we have to divide the overall market with more other firms. And therefore, the demand for my car is falling. This is the assumption or the explanation behind this, that we are dividing by the number of firms. And then, and this is maybe the the main point of this demand function, we are orientating on the average price in the whole sector. And this means if small p is larger than capital P, in fully competitive markets, you have assumed, well, you have no demand anymore. Because if you want to sell your pen for 2 euros and your neighbor is selling it for 1 euro, then everybody is moving to your neighbor. And now, again, my parents haven't moved to the neighbor. Well, maybe they would have moved if they had to pay 5,000 German marks more or 10,000. So we have a slight possibility to set higher prices. But of course, in general, we assume that if we have a higher price than the average price in the sector, then our demand is decreasing. Because if small p is smaller than capital P, then we have a negative number and we have a minus sign in front of the bracket, and minus times minus is plus. Then our demand is slightly decreasing. And what we also assume is that the sector size S is just an exogenous variable, that it is just an external number. I think now I have explained every letter within our demand function. And keep in mind, in general, it is more or less the same demand function which you have ever used in your lectures, but then it depends on the difference or the difference of the individual price relative to the average price in the sector. Okay, and now we take this demand and then we think, or this was this assumption here, that we have assumed the same cost structure. So we have here more or less a symmetrical problem. And well, this is now a quite fast explanation, but somehow we cannot go that deep within it. There is, of course, then some game theoretic argumentation, but I think qualitatively you can catch this. If every firm is more or less acting in the same way, then we have to have in the end also a symmetric outcome. And this then means that although we have this possibility, in the end, in the equilibrium price would then in the end these average price within the sector. Well, if everybody takes the same price, then of course the same price is of course also the average price in the sector. Feeding in, then small p minus capital P is 0, and then we can directly calculate the amount x, and this is then of course just S over N. So going back here, if this is in equilibrium 0, then of course we are only left with S over N. Every firm obtains the same market share. Well, and this X now we can put into our falling cost function here, X star. This is then fixed cost over, and think of this is a, so to speak, large division. So we then have to first take this small division, and this means we have to multiply with the inverse of S over N. Okay? So 1 over 3 is just 3 over 1. Or here 1 over S over N is N over S. Have to multiply with the inverse, and then we obtain here N times fixed cost times sector size plus marginal cost. These are all these are given numbers. So we obtain then a translation of our falling average cost function in output, translates after this argumentation here into increasing average costs with the number of firms in our market. So here just the straight line of average cost. And if we look then at the dependence on all these numbers, the more companies in the sector, this I have already said, the smaller the share of company in the sector, and the higher the average cost, the more difficult it will be, of course, to exploit increasing economies of scale. Well, and the qualitative argumentation is, of course, if this n increases and increases and increases, then, of course, in the end, your assumption of monopolistic competition is not a good assumption anymore. If you have 1,000 car manufacturers, this would not be then a good assumption anymore. Then you are moving, so to speak, in the neighborhood of fully competitive market. Okay, and now we, want to use this assumption that we are, so to speak, a little monopolist in our market. And for this, we just write this demand function in just another way. We just multiply out all our brackets. Then we have S over N plus S times B times P. And this I have already argued. Then we see more or less the same demand function which you already know, that we are setting S over N plus S times B times P as given numbers. So this is just a constant, and S times B is then just this the slope of your falling demand function. So we obtain then your known demand function. I think you have written down it like this in other courses. Is this true? Or you said then x is 12 minus 3x or something like this. Yeah. And then the 12 is your A and the B is your 3. Yeah. And what you then did is, okay, now we are in our monopoly. And what you have done then is that your profit is P depending on X, so to speak the inverse demand function times X minus C of X. So this is your revenue and this was your costs. Well, and in the monopoly, you then said P prime of X has to be 0, and this is nothing else than P prime of X times X plus P of X. Derivative of X with respect to X is just 1, so it vanishes, minus C prime of X is 0. Well, if you then put in your function here, x is a minus bx, then you have obtained the optimum condition within your monopoly, or I have written down it also here. And this is then, sorry, this is still German, so this is marginal revenue. And that you then, of course, your monopoly condition is marginal revenue, which I have written down here. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This is always the optimum condition for profits, no matter what kind of competition you have. And maybe also you remember this picture here, diagram. You have your demand function. And if it's linear, then you have your marginal revenue function. Just at, if this is half, this is then the half of B. No, not B. B is not good because this was, I defined it as the slope. let's say then, yeah, some constant C bar, half C bar, and then you said, well, if in our case, we have a constant marginal cost, so remember this horizontal line, and this was then marginal costs, and this was then your optimum output in monopoly. I think hopefully, this picture you remember, yeah? Okay, so this is just the same calculation you have already done in the monopoly. This is the optimum condition. I have already everything written down. You feed in just your specific numbers from your cost function and your demand function. And then we obtain, in the end, in equilibrium, P equals marginal costs plus 1 over N times B. And this is, so to speak, then your price setting competence due to the monopolistic competition. Because price equal marginal cost, this is what you have done in fully competitive markets. From this, then you have obtained your supply function. There you argued the supply within the supply function within your market more or less represents just the marginal cost function. But now we are under monopolistic competition, so we can charge a little higher price than the marginal costs. And this is then the markup due to monopolistic competition. Well, and what we see then here, more or less fortunately, because we already know from the other argumentation where we have average costs are increasing with the number of firms. Here we have price is 1 over N is decreasing in the number of firms. Well, and then in economics, we are quite happy when we have an increasing function in some variable and a decreasing function in some variable. What we are then doing, of course, in the overall equilibrium, everybody is competing with each other in the same market. Then we say, well, where do we have price equals average cost? And this we find then here. The latest derived function we call PP curve, decreasing in N. And the CC curve, average costs in our sector, average price in the sector, and overall equilibrium is then where we have average price equal average cost increasing in N. And of course, with our very simple assumption, the CC curve is just a linear line. And of course, again, our PP curve is somehow a shifted hyperbola, 1 over x plus some constant. So falling, and this would be then our equilibrium. So P star, N star, the equilibrium number of firms selling for this equilibrium price. 15 minutes left. This is nice because now this is, so to speak, then the competition between VW, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Opel, Ford, and everything within Germany. Of course, they are within Germany also competing under monopolistic competition. And what happens now when we are opening for the Japanese market, for the US American market? There we also find 3, 4, 5 car manufacturers. And what we are now forming is a much larger market. So to speak, still we assume every firm in the world is producing under the same production functions. They have more or less the same costs. We have to pay, so to speak, the same wages in Japan, in Germany, in the United States. So still all our argumentation also with this symmetric equilibrium still holds, but what has changed? As the market has changed. I can now not sell only for, we have 60 million people in Germany older than 18. Now I can also, I think in Japan we have 140 million people, so roughly 110 people, 110 million people or 120 million people can drive cars. So if we would take only Germany and Japan, then more or less the market size doubles. Well, curve, sorry. Here in the PP curve, production and so on, we do not find the market size as. But in the CC curve, here, so no S. Here we find an S. And what does it mean? Well, the slope here, fixed cost divided by the market size, becomes lower. So to speak, well, this is not very good done because they have to cut at the same part. I think. Can I move this? Let's say, then it's better. So let's do it like this. That it is hopefully correct then. Okay, here. But I think I took this picture just from the Krugman slides. So maybe it's also wrong there. Yeah. And what we now see, by increasing, by this increased sector, we can profit from these economies of scale, falling average costs. So we are moving down. So opening for trade means that we can buy our cars for a lower price in general. And what is also nice, remember, I think this was 10 slides before, the general assumption here. We assumed that we think it's quite nice not only to choose between two kinds of cars or two medium-sized cars, but between 5 medium-sized cars. Compare this maybe with the the communist way of producing. In the GDR, one car, maybe two with a Wartburg, but in general, everybody has to drive a Trabi. And this was maybe then one of the reasons. Of course, freedom is also okay, but also looking over the wall, Berlin Wall, seeing there these 10 different cars driving around, and the people said, well, this would be quite nice if I do not have only to choose between one car, so to speak. On the other way around, I think this I have heard sometimes in a marketing lecture that if we are going to the supermarket and then we see just more than 5 or 6 kinds of differentiated products, then in general we say, well, it's too enough, I cannot choose anymore. I don't know if this example is still made sometimes. That, so to speak, when there are already 10 different kinds of chips, adding an 11th one is not the best choice. And this is always you have to test your assumptions by reality. Are these still good assumptions? Maybe I've also talked in macro already about this. When I switched from physics to economics and writing my exams, then I said, well, this is very nice because all the mathematics I already can do. I do not have to learn anything. And even the calculation exercises were the more difficult, so to speak, within the exams. So this was quite nice for me. And then, yeah, starting to write my PhD, then I really found out, yeah, what is difficult, so to speak, in economics. And this is not in general the mathematics, but this is to build a good model which really explains reality. Okay, but we have 10 minutes left so that we argue then in the end, because of course, more or less for everybody, it's okay that we have lower prices right now. And think of, in general, we think, well, the companies want to sell with high price, or that they really think, well, the higher the price, the better for me. But take this general assumption here of decreasing average costs. They really can say, well, now I can sell more for a lower price, and that's okay for me because I have a production situation with increasing economies of scale. So to speak, for the supply side, it's okay that we have falling prices. And of course, the consumers are quite happy that the prices has fallen. And the consumers are also happy because here the product variance has increased, because the number of firms has increased overall I can choose of. So this means the number of product variance has increased. So to speak, again, we can also argue in this case that overall the welfare has increased due to our assumptions about the preferences and due to our assumptions that we have increasing economies of scales. So plus lower prices, which are okay for firms since we have increased increased returns to scale. And this then we can argue that overall welfare has increased by opening for trade. I think I've produced another slide for this. No, I think then we will end with this general argumentation, or with this general overview. Remember the starting point today when I made the revision of neoclassical international trade theory. There we said, well, we have an inter-industry trade, so different products. We are producing cars, United States are producing pharmaceuticals, and then we interchange cars with pharmaceuticals. And the argumentation was comparative advantage, specialization in different sectors, and so to speak, the direction of the trade flows are given. The cars are going to the United States, and the pharmaceuticals are coming from the United States to Germany. And this is, yeah, or I made here another example. Well, we have more or less no clothes industry anymore in Germany, only this sports manufactory down there in Baden-Württemberg. How is it called? This little one, he's the only one who is producing still. Trigema, this one. Only exception is Trigema, I think. And I think there's also some very specialized sports shoe manufacturer. Um, but everything else is coming from abroad. And yeah, especially in the last 10 years, Vietnam has created a large clothes sector. And then, due to economies of scale, and right now we have only argued with the internal economies of scale. Next week, since the 1st of May is on Thursday, we will meet, and then we will talk about external economies of scale. But at this point, we have intra-industry trade. Car from Germany to the United States, and cars from, or well, we do not buy that much American car. Or we are buying Ford, but we are buying Ford manufactured in Germany. So a better example would be Germany and Japan. So then we are exchanging product variants. So differentiated products, and then the trade flows are not given because cars to Japan and cars to Germany. And then we have, so to speak, calculate the saldo between export cars and import cars. And here I have the automotive sector, Germany and Japan. And then I think external economies of scale. We will talk about this next week. Okay, thank you very much for today.